I ran out of time on the previous video before I was able to mention the conquest of the Inca Empire in the Andes of the South America. The Incas had the largest empire, land-based empire, larger than the Ottoman Empire in the Old World, larger than Ming China, with 12 million subjects. But in 1528, Huayna Capac, the Incan king, and his his oldest son, who was his designated successor, both died of a European disease in 1528, leaving the succession to the Inca throne open to question, and a civil war broke out between Huáscar and Atahualpa, which Atahualpa emerged as the victor, and Huáscar died just about the time that Francisco Pizarro, his three half-brothers, an illegitimate bastard from Extremadura, Spain, arrived in Peru with 180 men and repeated from the same playbook that Hernan Cortez used in Mexico, kidnapping Atahualpa, demanding ransom, silver and gold from him, and then when his usefulness was ended, they persuaded him to receive baptism and become a Christian, and in order not to burn him at the stake, but to strangle him to death instead. And the history of Peru for the subsequent 30 or 40 years is particularly sordid and violent, and we do not need to go into it in detail at this moment. So now we're talking about the European conquest of America, the second half of Chapter 3, and we want to begin with the Ecological Conquest, or what is also known as the Columbian Exchange. So the Europeans brought diseases with them, such as smallpox, measles, influenza, for which the natives had almost no resistance or immune system resistance whatsoever. And so this created almost a holocaust of 90% of the Native Americans dying in the next century due to these diseases. Coastal Brazil lost 95% of its indigenous population in the 16th century. By 1600, only about 5,000 Tupi Indians remained on the coast of Brazil. Also, the Europeans brought with them imported animals from the Old World, such as horses, cattle, oxen, pigs, sheep, donkeys, goats, and chickens. By 1542, Peru had 467 grantees of encomiendas, and in Mexico and California there were 600. The King of Spain was not happy with this system and wanted to end the encomendero system. So he felt like he had to trim the power of the encomenderos. After Cortez's victory, he was forced to keep the institution of encomienda to use as a leverage over the conquistadores. Partly through the influence of Las Casas, the King Charles of Spain in 1542 issued what's called the New Laws, limiting encomiendas to tribute only and eliminating forced labor, at least in theory. The inheritance of encomiendas was restricted. This was an attempt to prevent a new nobility rising in the Americas through the encomienda system. Also, it was forbidden further enslavement of Native Americans. The new laws were never issued in the Portuguese Empire. This was strictly the King of Spain. This began a process of multiracial formation of a society. The new cadre of Spanish bureaucrats arrived in the Americas to oversee the new territories. Thousands of peasant Spaniards flocked to the Americas seeking to find their fortune, especially after rich silver lodes were found in the 1540s. There were many Spanish artisans that arrived in the New World. 90% of the Spanish immigrants were male. This led to interracial cohabitation between the Spanish men and Native American women, as well as African slave women. Martine Cortez was the son of Hernan Cortez and La Malinche. He became a page to King Philip II. There was a growing population of free blacks from Spain, as well as enslaved Africans brought to replace the diminishing Native American labor force. Africans had the immunity to Old World or European diseases that the Native Americans did not. The mestizos were from the result of the combination of Spaniards and Native Americans, and in Brazil they were called Mamelucos. Mulattoes were the result of the interracial mixing of Europeans and Africans. There was also an attempt of a spiritual conquest. The church was very involved with missionary and missionary orders, monastic orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, who attempted to rid the church of corruption, and they participated in the process of colonization. 12 Franciscan friars arrived in Mexico in 1524, and the Augustinians, Dominicans, and Jesuits soon followed after. Missionaries faced the daunting challenge of communicating with their potential converts. The first book printed in Mexico was a Nahuatl Catechism produced in 1539, Nahuatl being the Aztec language. In the 16th century, universities were established in Mexico City and Lima and began offering courses in Nahuatl and Quechua for men training to become priests. Family and community life changed dramatically. Franciscans and Jesuits in Brazil were rounding up Tupis in raids that resembled slave-gathering expeditions and then relocating them to compact mission villages called aldeias. The mission served as a tempting target also for slave traders, as you probably recall from the film The Mission. Native people's names were changed at baptism. They were given Christian names. Nevertheless, many of the Native Americans resisted Christianity in a number of ways. There were militant mass rebellions, such as the Taqui-Onkoi in the Andes in the late 1560s, which rejected all Christian symbols. In Brazil, the Santidade movement swept up Native Americans and Africans. They escaped the Portuguese and set up their own communities in the interior of Brazil. They had their own pope and their own bishops and sent out missionaries. There was a process called Syncretism. They often conformed outwardly, that is, people who were forcibly brought to the Americas, such as the Africans or the Native Americans who were forcefully conquered. They often conformed outwardly to the Spanish Catholicism while secretly continuing to practice native religious beliefs and practices. Here's a picture of the church, of a church in Brazil, I believe. The viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru were the oldest viceroys. This was located in Mexico City and Lima. The most powerful colonial officials in the 16th century were the vice kings in Lima and Mexico City. In 1535, Viceroy Mendoza relegated Martine Cortez to the sidelines in Mexico. He sent Coronado to investigate rumors of another empire to the north. Blasco Núñez Vela was assassinated by colonists in Peru. In 1550, Antonio de Mendoza died shortly after arriving. In 1569, the decisive and heavy-handed fourth viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, arrived and spent 5 years traveling around Peru, reviewing the situation. He defeated the rebel state of Vilcabamba in 1572. This was where Manca Inca had held out for all those years. He instituted what was called the Mita, a labor draft to supply labor for the silver mines, in which 1/7 of the Indian population would give 1 year of their lives to work in the mines. The Spanish colonial bureaucracy became ever more complex. In 1503, the Casa de Contratación was formed to handle the business of the Indies. A few years after that, about 20 years later, 1524, the Council of the Indies was set up to help the king oversee his domains in the Americas. Audiencias, which were legal courts, were formed in Santo Domingo, Guadalajara, Quito, and Santiago, Chile. Also, provincial governors were appointed, who reported to the viceroys, and cabildos, existed in local villages and towns. They were town councils. Many of the Spanish bureaucrats learned that in order to successfully govern in the New World, they had to follow a principle called obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey, but I do not carry out. And so they sometimes would just ignore regulations and rules and laws coming from Spain because they were impractical to implement. Portugal was rather different in its approach to royal government. It left the administration of Brazil early on to entrepreneurs and business people rather than bureaucrats. The French threat, French Huguenots fleeing persecution in France were settling along the coast of Brazil in the early 1500s. This threat caused King João to tighten his control of government in Brazil. So he sent Tomé de Susa as the royal governor general to Brazil in about 1530. The king ordered an end to native enslavement. Royal governors didn't achieve the same power that viceroys had in Mexico and Peru and Spanish America. Susa founded Bahia in 1549 with 6 Jesuits. Pope Alexander VI granted the patronato to the kings of Spain and Portugal. In return, the church received subsidies. Regular clergy, such as Franciscans and Dominicans, reported directly to their superiors, whereas the secular clergy answered directly to the bishop of their diocese, who was often appointed by the king rather than by the pope. There was much competition between the regular and secular clergy within the various orders, such as Franciscans and Jesuits, for example. King Charles was incredibly powerful. He was king of Spain. At the same time, he was Holy Roman Emperor of Austria and large parts of Italy, Holland, as well as Spain and most of the New World. In 1556, he abdicated his Spanish domains to King Philip II, his son, who became the world's first global monarch. In 1565, the Philippines were added to Spain, and in 1580, Portugal was added and all of Portugal's empire, when the last king of Portugal died without an heir. This was a siglo de oro, Spain's golden age, from about 1560s through the early 1600s. This is the time of Cervantes and Don Quixote. Nevertheless, there was trouble on the horizon. In 1566, the Netherlands revolted against Spain. In 1588, the massive Spanish Armada was defeated by tiny England. The best ships in the Spanish Armada were in fact Portuguese. The Dutch took over the sugar-producing area of Brazil in 1630. They attacked Brazil because it was Portuguese, and at that time the Portuguese were under the Spanish, and the Dutch and the Spanish were deadly enemies. In 1640, Portugal revolted against Spain under the Duke of Braganza. King João IV rose to the throne, the first Braganza king, and he expelled the Dutch from Brazil in 1654. Iberia's exclusive claims to the Americas were challenged in the early 1600s with the establishment of a British settlement at Jamestown. The Pilgrims and the Puritans followed in 1620 and 1630. The Dutch arrived in 1625 at New Amsterdam, today called New York. The Frenchman Samuel de Champlain sailed up the St. Lawrence River in 1603 to found Quebec, as you probably may recall from the film Black Robe. In 1680s, French explorers had traveled the entire Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico to New Orleans. So in conclusion, Columbus's voyage launched a military, biological, political, and ideological invasion of the Americas. It led to the creation of the first 2 seaborne empires of the modern era, which were the Spanish and the Portuguese. Later, the English, French, and Dutch empires followed along behind the Spanish and the Portuguese, ready to take their places with the New World and with the seaborne empires and global networks of trade and travel and exchange. So thus ends chapter 3 of Martin and Wasserman's Latin American Peoples, and we will